Hey everybody, I'd like to welcome y'all to today's South Talk with Dr. Adam Gussow, Professor of English here at the University of Mississippi, and Dr. Ken Kawashima, who is an Associate Professor of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. We'll get started in a couple minutes. I do have a few notes and announcements that I want to kind of get out of the way first. So we are, as we head into the stretch run of the semester, we're kind of also heading to the stretch run of South Talks, our South Talk schedule. Next week, we are taking a break, so there's no South Talk at all next week. Perhaps we will need to either celebrate or recover from. Maybe there won't be anything to celebrate either way, but Tuesday. But there is on Friday, the center is hosting a virtual open house. The Center for the Study of Southern Culture is hosting a virtual open house where you can get information about our MA and MFA programs. That open house is on Friday, November 6th at 3. And you can get registration info just on our website. So that's the Center for the Study of Southern Culture. The following week, we will wrap up our South Talk series for the semester with 3 talks, all focused on a documentary. November 11th at noon, Dr. Ralph Eubanks and David Wharton will present Looking at Southern Landscapes, Inspiration, Influence, and Impact. November 12th at 7, Jacqueline Olive will present Always in Season, 7 p.m. And November 13th at noon, the center will have our annual fall documentary showcase, which will feature work from students of the center. So those are just some notes. No South Talks next week. We'll have those 3, November 11th, 12th, and 13th. And then next Friday, so Friday of next week, the center will host an open house where you can get some info about our MA and MFA programs. And then finally, I'll just make a quick note about the format for today. So first, I see myself primarily as a facilitator. I have some questions prepared that I'll toss to Adam and Ken. Y'all will hear much more from them than from me. But if you do have questions, we do want to hear questions. We want to field some questions for y'all. So if y'all have questions, you can drop them in the Q&A box literally at any time from this point on. If there are parts of the conversation discussion that are relevant for a question or fit with the question that you ask, I'll insert it into the discussion. If not, or if the conversation gets so good that I don't want to interrupt, I'll make sure that at maybe at the 3:40 minute mark or thereabouts, to focus directly on audience questions. And we'll wrap up by 4. So in all circumstances, we'll wrap up by 4. Adam and Ken, I'm interested for the conversation today. I've got more questions than certainly we'll have time to get to. And as I was kind of mentioning before we got started here, and as I typically like to do when talking about a book especially, I want to begin at the beginning. Start at the start, and that is with the title. The title of, so this is I guess some folks, maybe 20 or 30% of the folks saw the pre-recorded conversation between Adam and Ken. Maybe some folks are coming in brand new. So This is a talk from my perspective that is about Adam's newest book, Who's Blues? Facing Up to Race and the Future of Music. But it's also a conversation about, well, we'll see what it turns into. But I want to start there, Adam, with the title, Who's Blues? Facing Up to Race and the Future of the Music. In the pre-recorded conversation, you share a little story about how that wasn't either the initial title or there were other iterations of the title of the book. So I wonder if you could recount that story for everyone. Where did this title come from?
Yeah.
And quickly, maybe somewhere in there, if you could say what you hope the book accomplishes, maybe give us the elevator version of, or the cliff notes of what the book is about. And finally, Ken, you know, where there is space or afterwards. I know you also had some comments in the pre-recorded conversation about the title, about the different titles, and maybe you kind of favored some or favored one over others. So wonder if y'all could both, starting with Adam, talk a little bit about the title of the book.
Sure. And so to do that will be to talk a little bit about how the book came into being. So, and I tell the story in the introduction to the book, but it's sort of relevant also because there's at least one reviewer who sort of said Gussow, took the lectures, his undergraduate lectures that he delivered in his undergraduate thing and put them in verbatim, and nothing could be further from the truth. So let me explain how this happened. In the fall of 2011, I taught my blues lit course here at the University of Mississippi, and when I finished it, I had a kind of empty feeling. It was that cold mid-December moment when suddenly you can do whatever you want to do if you're an academic. The term is over, and I felt like I had this YouTube channel in which I'd been preaching for the past 4 years to people from around the world about how to play blues harmonica, strictly kind of the mechanics. And I thought, but I'm a guy who teaches blues lit, and there's so much more to blues as I understand it than just the mechanics of how to play blues harmonica, as important as those mechanics are. And so I did a lecture in the front seat of my car on campus. And I basically pulled some books off the shelf that I had just been teaching. And I did one lecture. And it was sort of about one of the major themes in this book, which it was sort of about the way that people talk about the blues and the way that they ideologize the blues when they surround the blues with ideas as opposed to just consuming the blues or just playing the blues. It felt to me like there were these two big ways that people ideologized them. We're going to get into this more, I think. One of them was what I ended up later calling black bluesism. Blues, two slogans. Blues is black music, number one. And number two, no black, no white, just the blues. And I'd been hearing those terms, and in the book I talk about it. Anyway, that was lecture number one. And I felt like, 45 minutes in the front of the car. And next thing, I basically went and did another one the next day, and then I suddenly said, I'm going to do 12, and they're going to be 12 bars of them, and I'm going to teach some of the same stuff and some of the same texts that I'd been teaching, like the three H's, Hughes, Handy, Hughes, and Hurston, the three, Langston Hughes, W.C. Handy, Zora Neale Hurston, and then August Wilson, and so I, with Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is about to come out on, I guess, Netflix, and so I did sort of a series of lectures very rapidly, and put them up online beginning at the early in 2012, and I called them Blues Talk, and they just hung in cyberspace. At some point, I went back, maybe 4 or 5 years later, and I looked at them, and I thought, I think there's a beginning of a book here. I don't know if it'll work, but suppose I got a few of them transcribed, and suppose I went through and sort of rewrote them. I thought it was going to be easy. It was incredibly difficult, because very little of the language that was in the original lectures ended up being part of what I was doing. So I supplemented them, but what I did do is keep the kind of armature of the improvisatory lecture. And one thing led to another. I put them together. I cut a few of the original 12 out. I put some sort of rewritten versions of several other essays that I had for very different contexts, including one that was in a volume called, it was about the blues revival in the black arts movement, sort of tensions in the 60s blues scene. And then I brought it in to the publisher of my last book, and I said, I think I've got a new thing here for you. And it went through that long refereeing process, and towards the end, they said, so I called it Blues Talk, Making Sense of the Music in a New Millennium. Blues Talk because that was the title of the lectures, but also because I thought we talk about the blues in so many different ways. Brian, you're a sociologist. I'm an English department guy. Ken is East Asian Studies. Ken and I are both sort of practitioners. There's a range of languages, including when I teach Larry Neal in my course, the blues god, the the religious, African-centered religious sort of understanding of the blues. There's a whole range of ways that we talk about them, and discographers and folklorists. Okay. My publisher liked it up until it was time to begin to think about selling it. And then they said, you know what, that's not a sexy enough title. I don't know what the language was, but it was, we need to pump up the volume a little bit. And what about Who's Blues? And I thought, well, that's pretty contentious. And but we ended up working on the subtitle. Facing Up to Race and the Future of the Music happens to be very mellifluous. Ace, race, few, mu. So we got a little bit of poetry just in the rhythm of it.
Wait, what's that M word you just used? What does that mean?
A little. What did I say? Music, kind of music.
No, I can't.
Mellifluous. Mellifluous.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Comes from honey, honey-like. Okay. It's kind of smooth.
Sweet.
It has a certain songified kind of feel to it, which I liked. But who knew when we were settling all this that we were going to have the kind of summer we had? A summer in which issues of race and violence, both of which, by the way, are central elements of my book, were going to sort of be highlighted, and specifically the element of kind of possessiveness, sort of, I think, who owns culture, who speaks for culture, and representation. So Ibram X. Kendi's book, which is all about sort of numbers of racism, shows up whenever you have something that's not specifically statistically equal to population numbers. And I think a lot of people are maybe projecting some of that into this book. So let me, if I can give you 60 seconds more, could I do that? You ask a professor a question, and I'm
going
just
to
terrible.
start the timer.
All right, I will do it. So this book, I sort of framed it in three ways for my publisher. Number one, it's the first book to focus on racial tensions within the modern American blues scene. That's one of the things it does, staging a dialogue between those opposed pairs of sort of opposed slogans. But unlike others who view, potentially imagine these questions as a zero-sum game, what I do is enlarge it to say, blues is a global music. I've just written a long paper on that. It's a global music. And how did that happen? And what does that do to to questions about who owns the blues? That's number one. Number two, it's an introduction for blues fans who may not be unaware of the blues literary tradition. It's an introduction to the important writers of the tradition. And I actually think it's really, really important if we're thinking about what blues is. The book's mostly about blues music, but then it's also about blues literature and all of the themes that are raised by blues literature, which all suggest that the blues is not just music. I don't heighten that quite enough in my thing, but you do in your book, and I hope we can talk about that. And number three, somebody's already given me a review and said it's too academic. Well, most of it's not. I mean, I really was trying to take contemporary blues scholarship and detune it a notch for general readers who may not be aware that there's a lot of revisionist stuff from Paige McGinley and segregating sound, Carl Hagstrom Miller, somebody that Ken talks about. So that was in a bundle. That's sort of, I'll dump that on the desk. That's what the book's about.
And so we landed at Who's Blues from, was it Blues Talk?
Blues Talk.
Ken, you had some thoughts about maybe, I don't know if saying you liked one over the other is the right way to put it, but you had some thoughts about the two titles.
Yeah. Yes, I remember I received the manuscript because I was actually asked to review it. Is that okay to say? I mean, I reviewed the book. And I guess as an academic, but also I'm a historian by training. And so I'm used to reviewing books and so on. So, but I also knew about Adam, although I'd never met him personally. And I'd known about Satan and Adam for years. And, I was really surprised and pleasantly surprised to be contacted by him, and even more surprised to be part of, mentioned in this book of his. And, I just want to say I'm not a researcher or scholar of blues music, really. I mean, I'm a blues musician, or at least I consider myself one. And I've tried to learn as much as I can about not only the music, but about American history and so on. And it's an ongoing process, especially on the history of the South and American capitalism and questions of slavery and post-slavery. These are things that I actually study on my own for my own research pertaining to questions of colonialism and racism in the context of East Asia and Japan specifically, but weirdly, they kind of resonate with the American experience in ways that I won't go into. But anyway, so I received the book, and I was really excited to read it because one, it is about the contemporary blues scene and all of the different aspects of that world. It's a huge spectrum, obviously, but things like festivals, blues festivals, and concrete, aspects of performing, and the racial tensions that are found in those spaces. But I guess what I liked overall about the title, the first title, was it was about blues talk, meaning how do people talk about the blues? In other words, what are people's discourses on the blues? And so, interestingly, it's really about, I would call it blues discourse in some ways, which constitutes elements, we could say, of these blues ideologies. So theoretically, I saw that as kind of a promising way, because many people may think about ideologies, but they don't always think about discourse. They may think of discourse, but they don't think about ideologies. That's where a little bit of what I read about your work, Brian, it's this question of blues epistemologies. I think it's a very productive concept. So I was surprised to see it change to Who's Blues. And I thought, damn, I mean, it felt a little, frankly, market opportunistic to me, just to be a splashy title, and it just felt like it's a polarizing question that's opportunistically taking advantage of the racial tensions that exist. I thought at the same time, it's a fair question. Everyone's asking it anyway, so there's a legitimacy to it. I appreciate the subtitle. I think it kind of, marks out a certain position already. Facing up to race, actually, I really like that phrase. James Baldwin said, we can't change everything, but we can't change nothing if we don't face up to it, So that's what I thought about when I read that subtitle. So I'll stop there maybe for now.
Well, Adam, you looked like you were going to say something there at the end.
Yes, I was, which is that this was not, the change was suggested by my publisher. And negotiated. I mean, we worked on you go back and forth with a whole bunch of titles and subtitles, and so it's with my full approval. I did not say no. I understand that part of a book is selling the book, and I will be the first one to say that the title "Who's Blues" with a question mark kind of does arouse some emotions. This was all back in April, by the way, before the things that happened in late May and early June. Let me just say, what I've noticed is that it really does. It has already aroused emotions, and probably more of them from a certain kind of white blues player or aficionado. But I can't tell. I sent out an email this morning to a bunch of people, and I got on a mailing list that I have, and I got one back that read as follows. And I had one line in the email, which I think is relevant. I said, "We may not resolve all the problems that bedevil the contemporary blues world, but we're going to have a candid and thought-provoking dialogue and answer a few of your questions." And he wrote, "All this hand-wringing tripe from leftists and their sympathizers like you, I am out." Told my wife that. She goes, "He should be in." No, this is, come and find out. So I do want to say, don't let the title scare you, whoever you are, whatever you think I'm claiming. We're going to dig down into it a little bit.
Those damn leftists every time. I think I would probably be grouped in there too. So. And
I'm a liberal centrist for all that, so yeah, I'm not.
Ken, I wanted to go back to you actually, because you mentioned the word discourse that I had made a note about. You said in the pre-recorded conversation that this book was, I guess the book in Adam's work was creating discourse out of silence, which I thought was an artful way of putting it. I wonder if you could talk more about like the silence part. I won't say more. I wonder if you could say more about the silence.
Yeah, I guess that really was a genuine thought or feeling I had upon reading Adam's book, that I admired I thought it was a certain courageous effort to find a language that wasn't already colonized completely, maybe, somehow looking for a language by listening to people's discourses on blues, which are often not presented, or we may know about these discourses, for example, discourses of Black bluesism or blues universalism. We've all been maybe part of those conversations. Oftentimes, however, in my experience at least, they don't always become public discourses. They're kind of, sometimes they're behind closed doors, or they're kind of, it's like, some people will say like, let's take it easy. Let's not rock the boat and, make people uncomfortable, by talking about racism. And it's just about the music, man, or let's just enjoy this music. And, why make it a big issue? And then there's a kind of pressure to be silent about it, and there's a limit to that, first of all, because many people don't want to be silent about it, but they're somehow, in some ways, maybe bullied into being quiet about it. I don't appreciate that. No one really does. And Adam, I thought, tried to break it open. And so what a discourse always is, the hard thing is to create a new discourse. And really the only way you can make a new discourse is by, in some ways, tracing the old ones, but then knowing exactly where to break from those old discourses to create basically a new ideology. And that's what I thought was happening, or at least potentially is part of that. And especially when it comes to talking about race and racism and blues music especially, we all have to learn, how to talk about it. I just, as a basic belief, I'm not a blues scholar, as I said. I'm just a guy who plays blues, and that's all what I do. That's only what I can play. And we love talking about blues, and we should never be put in a position where we have to fear recrimination for speaking about how we feel about or think about or talk about the blues, including about race and racism.
Adam's trying to jump in there.
I'm champing at the bit. I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. So one of the, again, my book is like the blues, which always has one or more elements in tension. It's usually not just one thing, although when you're filled with rage at somebody who has done you wrong, it is one thing, but then by the same token, blues is often about two different things. Do I stay or do I go? One of the things I wanted to do very much was explode or problematize what I would call a pastoral conception of the blues. What I mean, and I'm somebody who loves the pastoral South mythology, the idea of it's a garden, everybody's happy, and there's no tension, and there's no racism, and there's no politics. It's just there's enough to eat, and you imagine the blues world like that. It would be a blues cruise. It would be all pleasure all the time, 24/7. I want to explore, but that is a sort of part of a pastoral conception of the blues. That blues is going to be all pleasure. Imagine it's a pure pleasure zone. There are people who actually imagine that it's that. And I wanted to say, I kind of take a counterintuitive thing. I say, for black Southerners in the age of Jim Crow, yeah, the juke joint might be a place where you hope to get away, actually, from all the stuff that was on the outside. And so maybe there's a point of commonality between white blues pastoralists who just wanted to be that beloved community. And I actually take the idea of beloved community and sort of the true interrelatedness of the human family within a blues context very seriously. It's something that's important to me. It's actually much closer to my experience in the blues world over the 30 or 40 years that I've been playing the music. And so I hope we can get to that. But that's not enough. And I thought it was really important to say, especially in light of the globalized blues audience, let's just take that idea of blues as black music. I know I have some sense of what people mean when they say that. And my book specifically says there's much more truth in that direction than there is in the no black, no white, just the blues, even though I'm willing to understand what people who use the latter slogan mean. But it's really important, if there are tensions within the contemporary scene, if there are voices that need to be heard that say, they treat me better in Europe than they do in Chicago, we need to listen to people who say that. If there are people who say, I think that the idea of an all-white blues festival is crazy, we need to be willing to hear people who say that. And if there are people who say, I don't think lynching has anything to do with where the blues came from, then I want them to listen to what B.B. King said. And I quote him at length. I won't do that now, but I quote him at length. He said, he talked about people being killed down in Mississippi, back where he came from, and how that bothered you in the back of your mind. And then at a certain point, it hurt you, he said. And so that's where my blues come from. He said that in 1968, just as he was crossing over to the white audience, Brian. So for me, it was that moment early in my graduate career when I came across that, and that paradox. Racial violence and the pain instantiated by it is where his blues came from. And he said the next most important thing to that is your woman. And yet blues seems to be about, in more cases than not, the lover who's left, the lover who's hurt you, the lover who confuses your mind. And that is a place where blacks and whites and everybody in the world may actually be able to come together even if we don't all necessarily share what I call the disciplinary violence and the threat of it that lies behind, the way, for example, that Black Southerners did back in the day, and the way that Black folk may today. I think we can talk about why the blues is, why the Reclamation Project happens to correspond almost exactly with the period since Trayvon Martin was shot. We can look at that. The last 8 years is a period in which Black bluesism has become ascendant. It's gained much more of a voice. And I think that's not a coincidence. So yeah, I'll pause for a moment.
So it's funny you say audience. That's the first. It's one of my keywords. Yeah. And I got a cluster of questions around it. And I'll just kind of cut to the chase, because one thing that I found myself doing as I was reading through the first, especially that introductory chapter, is trying to locate myself in either, the camp of Black bluesism, the blues is Black music. Well, actually, that's not true. I did not struggle to locate myself, but I was thinking of where, sort of how I would respond to some of the points that come up in that introductory chapter, especially as it relates to this idea of Black bluesism. And so I guess I'll pose this as a question, and this is for you, Adam and Ken. Perhaps you'll have some thoughts. My question is like, where does this idea of the blues fit, right? If you use the language of dialectic, a few times, many times, wherein on one side there's the blues is Black music, on the other side no Black, no white, just blues. Where does this idea fit? And this is rooted in the work of Clyde Woods, who you mentioned in the conversation before this started, Development Arrested. The idea that actually the blues ain't music anyway, not first.
Ooh, okay.
Right? That the blues is actually a method of making sense of the world that you are in. The blues is a perspective. It's a way of confronting a set of challenges, a set of obstacles that are a part of your lived reality, and that requires like a lot of different things, a lot of different techniques, gives way to a lot of different traditions. One of those traditions is like this culture, like all of the things that we associate with blues music, right? So that's one outgrowth of this broader blues method, one small outgrowth of this broader blues epistemology, but it isn't the whole of what the blues is. And in fact, if we start with music first, we doing it wrong. I agree. So where would you locate? Because I found myself frustrated in because it seemed that this seemed very much to be a conversation about that led with, you say you agree, but it seemed like it led with, I just felt like I was reading about bickering, maybe that's putting it too lightly, over who owns the music, when from this camp, blues methods, like the music is just like this one little outgrowth of this much more expansive and vibrant thing. So I guess respond to that in any way, but I'm wondering where you would locate that perspective. The person who would say, I don't want to talk about music, not first. I want to talk about this broader set of methods and the conditions that require them.
Okay. So one thing I do in the book, and I do it sort of chapter by chapter, starting I think with the second chapter, but I haven't gone back. In fact, I'll take a look at the end just to remind myself of exactly, because it's important, which is that when I teach the blues, so there you go. When I teach the blues, I teach it as a 4-part structure, and I recapitulate this structure and kind of take people through it. I say blues conditions lead to blues feelings. It's how to teach undergraduates, how to simplify it. It's one schematic among many. Blues conditions lead to blues feelings. They're not identical with blues feelings, although music often represents them both intertwined. which issues in blues music or blues expressiveness, all of which is surrounded by what I call the blues ethos. What you call the blues epistemology probably contains some of the things that I would put in the blues ethos. The idea that the universe is, there's a circular movement, and if I see you if I'm going down and you're going up, guess what? Eventually, I'm going to be checking you out, and we're going to be going in the other direction. The idea that improvisatory agility is a really important thing, especially if the world is constructed to sort of set up to sort of frustrate you at every turn. You don't want to harden. You don't want to say, trouble in mind, babe, I'm blue. You want to say, trouble in mind, babe, I'm blue, but I won't be blue always. So you can put the condition there, and it can be a race-wide condition if you want, or it can be an individual condition. But you say, but I won't be blue always because the sun's going to shine in my back door someday, which sort of encapsulates both those things. You got to be willing. You can't harden yourself in that down position. You got to be willing, because that's only a fool or a child would do that. You have to be even though there is a time for mourning, and I think America's in a time of mourning right now. But by the same token, you have to be ready. And Honey Boy and all the blues autobiographers always show that there's always something that potentially is like an opening, and that sun is going to shine. Big Joe Williams is going to come along and take you south to New Orleans, and you're going to learn how to make money on the street. When you come home, if you're Honey Boy, you do not have to work in the cotton fields all day for $1. So that's sort of where I go with that. You're absolutely right. And humor, blues humor. And so I talk about the blues ethos contains blues humor, and I talk specifically about Sterling McGee, Mr. Satan, the Mississippi-born guitar player that I worked with for many years, who just passed away in the after effects of COVID, by the way. And he would say, I had so many wives die on me, I was thinking of opening a funeral parlor. And he would do that when I would complain about like a girlfriend trouble. Then he'd sort of throw that at me as if to say, number one, your problems are trivial compared to my problems. But number two, look at me, I'm laughing at it, which is a sort of a version of what Hughes called, laughing just to keep from crying, kind of hardening pain with laughter. And so those are all elements, I think, of a blues epistemology. It doesn't entirely, I think the way Clyde Woods uses it, it's much more extensive in some ways, but I think that's one translation that I might make. So you're right, it's not just the music. By the same token, it is the music that's going around the world. It's the music that B.B. King brought to 56 countries in the course of his international touring over many decades. B.B. King plays America the most, Canada next, and then Japan. He tours the third most time. So blues is huge in Japan. A friend, Mitsutoshi Inaba, who wrote an essay about Robert Jr. Lockwood and about the way in which what Japanese blues fans see in Robert Jr. Lockwood is an aspect of a Japanese national ethos of persistence. I think it's the same thing that motivates, by the way, the Japanese marathoners. Finland has its own sisu, it's called, as sort of you absolutely do not give up ever. That's an element of the blues ethos, persistence, persistence, persistence. They see that in him. So that's potentially a blues epistemology, and it connects Black Mississippian with a younger Japanese audience. So I'm always looking for those connections. I hope that answers the question a little bit. Yeah.
I think this is a related, I'm going to jump to the Q&A, an audience question, because I think it's related to some of the points you just made. And then I want to take a couple of questions. So cool. The question that I would like to get to, and maybe Ken, you could think through this, because I'm going to offer this first question to Adam, but I guess either of you could answer either. The question perhaps for you, Ken, and the second is just, the question is, are y'all going to talk about women in the blues, writers and or singers? And I know you, Adam, we get that in the book. And so maybe we can get to that in just a second, but I want to get to this question from Chandra Williams. Looking forward to reading each of your books. Question, where do we introduce the African community into this conversation? Can the question of whose blues be answered without taking into account the Ali Farka Touré's and those who truly know the existential origins of this art form? Brian said it right, a method of confronting your reality. It is an ancient method at that. Is there an interest in the shift to examining the ancestral music to blues and the consequential redefining of the genre?
So I can actually answer that, because we're just sort of in the finishing phases of copy editing an issue that I put together called Blues Music in Transnational Context. And I wanted specifically international cohort of scholars. And so I've got two essays about blues in Africa, one by a young Senegalese scholar in America, and one by an Indian-born graduate student, Kirthi, who I work with on his MA essay, and who writes about Songhai blues. So he actually he's a grad student who left the program to go and be a road manager for Songhai blues, which is kind of cool. He found in me somebody who was very amenable to that. Songhai blues. So I'm not an expert on intersections between African music and the blues these days, but Songhai blues. Songhai blues is the band were one of the two major ethnic groups in Mali who came south to Bamako, the capital. By the way, I'm getting feedback. I don't know why it suddenly started. Came to the capital and felt exiled and had always embraced. They were connected with Ali Farka Touré. One of them, I think, was in a relationship with one of Touré's children, I believe. Where am I going to go with this? Blues for them had a complicated meaning, not just one meaning. Blues was partly a marketing category. It was a way of saying, we have a music that we call it blues, although we know it doesn't sound exactly like American blues. We know it has connections with a kind of music here that has been seen as sort of African blues. And we know it's going to help us connect with a world audience that will find it easier if blues is in the title of our band. So again, sort of multi-dimensional connections. The other essay is about an African blues singer named Amanita Fall, somebody I had not heard of, somebody from the 40s and 50s and 60s who was an actress in Senegal, grew up in Saint Louis, Senegal. And one of the points that he makes using Joseph Roach's ideas is that for people in Senegal, American blues, it feels to them like the blues has been in Senegal all along. And like it's being returned as in a sort of form that even the American players don't realize how sort of continually animated those energies have been in Senegal because of the sort of transatlantic vortex, the sort of constant circulation through the centuries of energies, clothing styles. My point is both of these essays together totally basically blow out of the water the sort of old idea that what we're doing when we go to Africa, if we're blues scholars, is sort of searching for the roots of the blues. It's much more complicated than that. And there are of course contemporary Africans who play blues. I discovered this when I went to Dakar, the one and only time in Africa, back in 2004 for the Buki Blues Festival. And I was asked actually to play on stage with some Casamance musicians. And I had a harmonica that was a diminished fifth away from the key center that they were establishing with their stuff, and everybody made me play anyway. And I said, I can't do that. And everybody seemed to like it when you kind of pick up on the riff. It doesn't matter. You're making music together. But they have a musician, Vieux Macfay in Senegal, who plays kind of this mix, this contemporary mix, which is it's Chicago blues, it's some African tonalities, it's some world music, including reggae, some rhythms. So again, blues goes around the world. Africa is a key element of that, and a key element of contemporary sort of blues understandings, I would say. So great question.
I would respond to that question by saying, actually my own musical project right now, I call it the Venn diagram, where there's three circles that intersect. Really the epicenter for me is right where you guys are, Mississippi. And there's another circle that goes down south to the Caribbean. And then there's another big circle really that goes all the way to Africa. And I'm trying to learn all three kinds of the circles and create new music in that space. And that requires, above all, of course, locating the connections to Africa. But also it means also kind of bracketing out a certain kind of, I think, hyper-Americanized representation of blues. So your transnational emphasis, Adam, I think is a really important one, or a worlding. Think of blues in blues in the world, blues in the world, and not just reduce it to the national form as it's so typically done without any, critical self-reflection. And if you think about the origins or the, the blues as it came out in the 1930s and 1940s, a lot of that music, I know, and people have said, that comes from the Caribbean, comes from Africa, comes even from Mexico, comes from Venezuela, and Trinidad, Barbadian music, like these kinds of calypso traditions, up through New Orleans and stuff. All that gets mixed all into what's called blues. But a lot of that, I think, after maybe the 1950s or 60s, a lot of that I would call it kind of transnational or non-American influences somehow get diluted. They get kind of marginalized.
Except for one, which is the British blues thing. And so one thing that I discovered in trying to write this essay about sort of an empirical kind of like how does blues actually spread around the world? And it turns out B.B. King's hugely important, but also the way that a lot of the world took the blues was from the Rolling Stones and from Cream. They took, and the sort of, and what's interesting, and then later Stevie Ray Vaughan. And what's interesting about this, the woman who had the person who had the question about women's blues, is that it's that guy band thing that ends up dominating. It's not hegemonic, but it means there's a much more established sort of, as blues moves, it moves down to Chile, as it moves, and South American countries, as it moves into Asia, especially with the help of British sort of Air Force bases and the radio, American Armed Forces radio and British radio. They're not playing the women mostly. They're playing more guy stuff. And so blues cultures around the world tend to have a kind of masculinist bias.
Yes.
Janis Joplin, it does come out, and so there are exceptions. But one thing that struck me was just how little evidence I was able to find of women performing in these globalized blues scenes. In India, a little bit in India, which is a fairly recent scene. So you do have exceptions. And then, of course, there's Luna Lee, the South Korean YouTuber who's not part of a scene, but she's a phenomenon that I hope, I'll just say Luna Lee, go and look for Luna Lee. She takes Elmore James, Dust My Broom, and she does it on the Gayagum, kind of a long South Korean zither, and does lead and rhythm by dividing herself too. It's an interesting place that blues goes these days. Anyway.
I wanna jump to this question from Rodrigo. Which is the question we referenced earlier. Rodrigo writes from Chile. I'd like to ask Adam a question about the relationship between blues and trap music, which I think we might think of as sort of the relationship between blues and more contemporary genres and subgenres of Black American music. The blues was born as the musical expression of a disadvantaged social group and fulfills the social function of raising the voices of the experiences and desires of that community. Following the historical movement of that social group, rap music appears as the continuation of that experience, as a new way of expressing experiences. And now trap music takes that place. At least in South America, trap is the music of the young proletarians. This loss of connection with the direct material experience can be read as a cause of the hygienization of the blues. We are all friends, no conflicts of race or class. The blues has become the archaeology of social pain, while trap is the current way of expressing it. If Cardi B had been born 100 years ago, would she have sung the blues? So I'm interpreting this as if I was just going to generalize the question and maybe hopefully not reduce the sort of complexity. And I guess it's not really a sort of direct question, but I don't want to. Hopefully don't reduce the complexity of the point here, but maybe we can think of this as a question about some of the relations between, the blues from way back when, which is, and more contemporary instantions of Black American music.
I am not a rap scholar, except for Cowboy Troy, which I know disables me from calling myself a rap scholar. But I'll just have one comment. So one thing that struck me, and I'm always looking for the problematics. So it strikes me that in the question is this idea, and certainly the argument could be made for blues and rap continuities. Bring in the news. But I just finished reading B.B. King's autobiography for the umpteenth time. And B.B. King talked about a certain kind of blues musician, stereotype of the blues musician. He's somebody who's sort of low class and unshaven and drinks and beats his woman. And B.B. King said, I wanted my blues to be different. I wanted my blues to give people, you're moving on up. And so I do think we need to make a place for the idea that blues is not necessarily always down and dirty and gritty and street level. Blues is, even though that's the kind of music that I made with Mr. Satan by and large, that blues also is, as Albert Murray would say, it's a place for stylization and grace and putting on the Ritz on a Saturday night and dressing up and uplift in a curious kind of way. And so that's the only thing that I have to say about this. It doesn't really say what he probably wants me to say, although I think these continuities are important. I'm hoping that you guys can maybe help on this one.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. So I was at the Center's music symposium a year or two ago. I was in conversation with Dr. Zandra Robinson and Charles Hughes, Dr. Zandra Robinson, Dr. Charles Hughes. And this was, so I have my book here, right? And this, I guess, will be my 2 minute, a 2 minute kind of point pulled from my own work. But I was still at that point trying to get a grasp on what it would be that I'd be saying here. For a long time, even as I wrote this as a dissertation and finished and defended it, I think I was starting with I think my starting point was blues music, which is kind of circling back to something that I mentioned, 20 or 30 minutes ago. And so I thought that what I was hearing from folks in Clarksdale, this idea that I don't like the blues, I don't go to the blues festivals, I don't go to the blues clubs, I don't want to see a bunch of blues festivals and clubs, and in Clarksdale's long-term sort of development development trajectory. I thought that what I was hearing was, I thought I was hearing from the post-blues South, after the blues, right? So there's all this sort of referencing the work of Mark Anthony Neal and so many other folks who talk about this post-soul aesthetic, the sort of the where Black culture has come since the 1960s and 1970s. I thought that I had something to say about the post-blues South. And both Zandria and Charles, they reacted, their bodies reacted in the same way as if they had the same thought at the same time. And Zandria said that the blues is the method. Soul is blues. R&B is a blues. Rap, hip hop is a blues. Blues is what produces, right? Blues is the root. Blues is the foundation. And so I think, at least when I read any questions about asking about this connection between blues and more contemporary music genres, that's where I go, is that it's not only is there a continuity, but like they the same thing. They the same thing. They just sound a little different. The method manifests in a different way, or gives rise to a different sound, which is a bigger conversation that maybe I will give in my own book conversation. But we're to 3:50, so we're 10 minutes or probably 6 or 7 minutes left. I'm gonna look over. So
could I just respond to that last point though?
Yeah. Go ahead.
The Chilean gentleman question on trap music. What I like about that question, which is I think the key point of the question, is, and I'm not. This isn't to contest what you just said. I agree pretty much. What I like about the Chilean audience members' question is we try to think of music, especially protest music or rebel music, that come out of these real concrete material conditions. So the blues came out of material concrete conditions. Howlin' Wolf said that too. It's about the conditions. What are those conditions? And those conditions will be corresponded with a certain mode of expression, that's longing for freedom. And every we could say it makes us be historical when we think about the blues, or it makes us think more concretely, for example, about racism. You can't say that racism in 1600 is the same as racism in 1865, or 1880, as Du Bois said. They have different, and we could say the root of racism is still there, but the articulation of the conditions in society and all the political, cultural sociological aspects that map onto those conditions, that creates a unique articulation, according to Stuart Hall. And that's, I think, a really important point. We think of blues in different articulations in different moments. B.B. King in 68 is going to be really different from Ma Rainey in the 1930s, you know, and same with Adam Gussow playing blues today. It's going to be very different from even his own blues, probably from 15, 20 years ago. You know, if we try to make that correspondence and not just use these vague things about blues, this, that, you know, we tie it down to those historical moments. And I speak as a historian, you know, because otherwise we are totally lost exactly in pure ideology, you know.
Good point. Yeah.
I would say that. So
I want to jump to, it's kind of a personal question. We got 5 minutes, so maybe rapid fire answers from the both of you. What specific facet drew you to blues music? Have you always felt totally secure and adequate in playing the blues?
Is this for me? Where I can start?
Maybe for both, yeah.
Yeah.
This can kind of wrap us up, I think.
I'll try to be quick. I grew up in a family where my father was a sort of amateur jazz record collector, so I heard that kind of music around a lot. I was thinking a lot about this, and I can tell you what led to my turn, something I've never talked about publicly. What led to my turn in 1984, 85, was that I was very afraid of being killed. I knew there were weapons pointing at me all the time. And it sounds kind of crazy, but I had read Jonathan Schell's The Fate of the Earth in February of 1982. The biggest march in American history, protest march, was in June of 82. My father was an anti-nuclear activist. He put paintings on the streets of New York. And I actually felt, I went through a period, I was probably a little bit schizophrenic in the layman's terms, but I went through a period after a relationship broke up, a 5-year relationship, where I really felt, not suicidal, I felt the weapons pointing at me. I felt like my ass was on the line. And I felt like the weapons were they were cruise missiles. I knew the Russians, they were where Western civilization had gone. I got completely and totally disillusioned. Now, I might look like a privileged white man with, Ivy League degrees, but the way I saw myself at that point was I saw myself in the firing line. And I had with weapons that were the fruit of cerebration, the fruit of the best thought that men could produce. And it made me incredibly cynical, incredibly scared, and it made me hug the blues with everything I had. And I happened to meet with a guy who called himself Satan, or Mr. Satan, who had life force and who gave me a place by him where I could work out all of that anxiety and feel like I was being brought back to life. So I've never told that publicly, but I thought about it on the way over here today, and I thought I might as well just say that's where it came from. It's thoroughgoing disillusionment. Sorry, Ken, I don't want to steal all the last little bit of time we got, but where did your blues come from?
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Ken, we got a couple minutes.
Yeah.
We got a couple minutes.
Yeah, I guess for me, when I first heard blues in Ohio when I was a little kid, it just somehow resonated a deep feeling, and then basically when I started playing blues in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, I just realized how basically repressed I was my whole life. I learned to kind of I was encouraged, to cut loose, to speak my feelings, and not be ashamed or embarrassed, to just put it all on the line, basically, put my feelings on the line in voice. And for me, it was very empowering, and it gave me a lot of confidence because, it was so encouraging on the west side, the Black community specifically, because there weren't many white people at all in this community. And they really, I felt like they were passing on a tradition to be strong, to rebel, to not be afraid to protest, and to even be audacious, and to be Sugar Brown. Basically, when I was called Sugar Brown, it was kind of a badge of honor that I could be part of a club where all these guys had nicknames, and gals too. And it was basically a feeling, a little bit of freedom, and we got to carve that space out and protect it. That's what I learned, and that's what drew me to it still today.
Ken, I was going to just say one thing that I recognize in listening to your story and thinking about mine is that the power of community, that what we discovered when we traveled with the blues and went into these Black communities, is we discovered this extraordinary soul force that was there, that had this kind of redemptive energy that's impossible to describe unless you've experienced it and then been transformed by it. And so that takes us back to the blues epistemology. There was something, Brian, that there was something in the music, but it was in the people. The music was simply the flux, that was the energy field that helped create the feeling between the people. I hope maybe that's a good place to end. Maybe.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so. I want to thank y'all for what I thought was an invigorating conversation, and at least there are a few things that I have to think about as I return to my own work. After I'll stop rambling and turn it over to. Okay. All right. Well, thank y'all. I think
you all are fine. You were great. This is a great conversation. I really just wanted to be able to say that. Thank you, Adam, Ken, and Brian. Thanks. What stuck with me was blues is a method for making sense of the world you're in 2020. We're going to get some great blues, some great trap, some great rap, some great jazz, some great everything out of 2020, right? I mean,
in the next week, there's a lot of history coming up.
That's our silver lining. Sad songs, maybe happy songs.
Yeah, we'll find out.
So
songs.
Thank you all, and thank you for our viewers. I mean, Switzerland, Boston, British Columbia, Chile, Illinois, everywhere. Thank you all. And visit our website for the rest of our events this year. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, y'all. Y'all take care.